E, G, Sa, Q. Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause.
On 5th July 2023, the Penang Chief Minister Yang Amat Berhormat Chow Kon Yeow officially launched the Penang Hokkien Dictionary and Learn Penang Hokkien YouTube channel. In so doing, he ushered Penang Hokkien into a new era where we can put away illiteracy and embrace a future where the people of Penang can learn to speak, read and write their home language.
I'm sharing that it is very difficult is in my text that if a dialect or a language has the written form in a written language, then it can preserve hopefully forever. But if a dialect or a language has not written form, it is so easy to lose it over generation because it is not passed down in the written form, but passed down through generation, remembering how to pronounce or how to say certain words in the dialects or language.
When I started work to preserve and modernize Penang Hokkien exactly 10 years ago, I never imagined the day would come that the Penang state government would support what I am doing. I am incredibly grateful to the government for the support, not just for me, but for the countless people who have supported my work and all those who love Penang Hokkien. Penang Hokkien is spoken not only by the Hokkiens in Penang, but also by the Teochews, the Cantonese, the Hakkas, the Taishanese, the Hokjius, the Hainanese, and quite a number of Malays and Indians as well. It is truly everybody's language. And yet, most of us do not know much about its history. In the past 10 years, as Penang Hokkien began to slip away from us, many of us felt the urgency to do something to arrest the slide. But the majority of us do not know enough about the language to rescue it and to reverse that slide. My name is Timothy Tai. I am a digital content curator. Long before I started work to preserve Penang Hokkien, I was already well known for my website, which is used by thousands of people every day to look for place information, not only about Penang, but also of other places in Malaysia and Singapore. My mother is Hokkien, but my father is Taishanese. But he is only Taishanese by name because he could not speak any Taishanese. Neither could I. Our home language is Penang Hokkien. Penang Hokkien is the language that provides me with home intimacy. Not being Hokkien, does that mean I am not qualified to save Penang Hokkien? That would not be fair. I have so many friends in Penang who are Cantonese, Teochew, Hakka, yet they speak Penang Hokkien as their home language. So my approach is to save, preserve and modernize Penang Hokkien as a language that belongs not just to the Hokkien, but to all of us. My stand is, you don't have to be Hokkien to speak Penang Hokkien. But why do we speak Penang Hokkien? Where does it come from? And why is our Hokkien different from the Hokkien spoken in Klang, Singapore and Taiwan? Many of you may have the same questions but do not know where to find the answer. So in this video, I want to share with you my journey to discover the history of Penang Hokkien and to tell you a few things about the language which you might not otherwise know. We learn from history that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Chinese seafaring merchants visited ports throughout Southeast Asia to trade. The naval voyages of Zheng He, despite all the attention given to them, did not introduce trading routes to the Chinese merchants. These routes, known as the Maritime Silk Road, have always been there prior and after Zheng He passed through. And while Zheng He's voyages were a government-sponsored enterprise carried out on behalf of Ming emperors, concurrent to these imperial voyages were private mercantile activities which were lesser known. We learn almost in passing that during the Malacca Sultanate, Chinese merchants came to trade. But who were the Chinese merchants and where were they from? I have to say that past historians were sloppy in their description. The term Chinese is too vague and a disservice to the history of the people involved. China is a vast country with people speaking many different Chinese languages. Where in this vast expanse of China did these merchants come from? To uncover that, I delve into researching the history of the Chinese in peninsular Malaysia, and when that does not supply me with adequate information, I research also the history of the Chinese in Thailand, the Philippines, and Taiwan. What I learned is that the so-called Chinese merchants came not from anywhere in China, but from a specific province. It's a province in southern China called Fujian, which is the Mandarin name for Hokkien province. But China has many provinces. Why did the people of Fujian province take to the seas, and where in Fujian province did they come from? The answer to the first question is, the Hokkiens took to the seas because they live in a mountainous province. The geography is not conducive to agriculture, so they looked seaward for their livelihood. They became fishermen, merchants, and pirates. As for the second question, the answer are two seaports on the southern coast of Fujian province. The name South China Sea does not adequately credit the role they played. Hokkien-speaking seafarers created the network of sea routes across the South China Sea and dominated trade there. Yet they do not feature in most records, keeping a low profile and are simply mentioned as Chinese. Even the Chinese themselves did not credit the Hokkiens. The South China Sea was simply known as Nanfang Hai, meaning Southern Sea. Yet, while the Japanese controlled trade on the East China Sea, the Hokkiens were the ones dominating the South China Sea right up to the 19th century. These Hokkien merchants, they did not come from anywhere in Fujian province, but rather from two specific seaports, Zhangzhou and Quanzhou. These are the Mandarin names for Jiangzhou and Zhuangzhou. These two seaports are only 128 kilometers from each other. That's the distance between Georgetown and Kuala Kangsar. And yet, the people from these two ports speak two different variants of Hokkien. The Hokkien language is one of the most diverse of Chinese languages with multiple variants owing to the mountainous nature of Fujian province. The Hokkien seafaring merchants of Zhangzhou and Quanzhou would visit different seaports in Southeast Asia anywhere they could engage in trade. When asked who they were and where they were from, instead of saying they were from Zhangzhou or Quanzhou, they pronounced themselves as Hokkien people from Hokkien province. In so doing, they appropriated the name of their province for themselves, and in centuries to come, the world would identify them and their language as Hokkien. However, the language spoken in Zhangzhou and Quanzhou, which the seafarers call Hokkien, is not the only language in Hokkien province, and neither of these two seaports is the capital. The capital of Hokkien province is the city of Fuzhou, also known as Hokjiu, where a different language is spoken. However, Fuzhou does not have a seafaring tradition, and as a result, its language is eclipsed by that spoken in Zhangzhou and Quanzhou, whose seafaring merchants go all over Southeast Asia advertising themselves as Hokkien. It was only in centuries later that linguists segregate the Hokkien province by its spoken language. They use the river that flows through Fuzhou as the geographic separator. The name of that river is the Min River. So, languages spoken north of that river is called Northern Min or Min Pei. Those to the east of the river is Eastern Min or Min Tong, and that includes Hokjiu. Those to the south as Southern Min or Minnan, and that includes the languages of Zhangzhou and Quanzhou, and an outlier called Putian. The name of the province itself, Hokkien, is actually the portmanteau of the names of two cities in Hokkien province, namely Hokjiu and Qianjiu, which is today's Nanping. From the Hok in Hokjiu and Qian in Qianjiu, we get the name Hokkien. and neither city is Changzhou or Quanzhou. In the 16th and 17th centuries, merchants from either Changzhou or Quanzhou would crisscross the South China Sea, visiting various seaports including Malacca during the Sultanate period and later during the Portuguese and Dutch administrations. When times were good and China opened its doors to foreign trade, only men were allowed to leave China for mercantile activities. And so, the Hokkien seafaring merchants who arrived in Malacca were entirely men. Women are rarely ever allowed to leave China, if at all. It is therefore a major question mark how Princess Hang Lipo, if she existed at all, was able to leave China to be wedded to Sultan Mansur Shah. But the seafaring Hokkien merchants did leave their presence in Malacca and is there to this day. To strengthen their business, they often took on local wives with whom they established satellite families while keeping their main family in Changzhou and Quanzhou. To their satellite families, these Hokkien merchants were able to pass on their culture and even their surname, procreating descendants who ascribed to being Hokkien. But one thing they were unable to pass on to their offspring, and that's their language. These Hokkien merchants were always on the move, going from port to port as the trade winds took them. So, the role of raising their local children fell on the shoulders of their local wives, who of course spoke Malay. And as a result, we have an entire group of Malacca Hokkien people who speak what we know today as Baba Malay. They are the Malacca Chinese Peradakans, meaning they are the issue of Hokkien merchants with local wives. The Hokkien seafaring merchants demonstrate that as long as only men were allowed to leave China, the result are offsprings that do not continue their language tradition but are naturalized to the local languages. But if that were the case, how then is it possible for the Chinese in Malaysia to be speaking a variety of Southern Chinese languages? One thing appears certain. In order for the Hokkiens in this region to pass their language to the next generation, there has to be Hokkien-speaking women in their midst. But what could break that ban on women leaving China? As I traced the history of Fujian province, I came upon that event, and that is the fall of the Ming dynasty. It began in 1644, when traitors from within opened the gates of the Great Wall, allowing Manchu troops to enter Beijing. This led to the last Ming emperor committing suicide, and with that, the empire began to unravel. Having conquered Beijing, the Manchus began invading the country from north to south, replacing the Ming dynasty with their own Qing dynasty. One by one, Chinese provinces fell to Manchu rule, and in every province the Manchu troops passed through, they left trails of bloodshed in their path. But the transition from Ming to Qing administration was not entirely smooth. When Manchu troops arrived in the southern provinces, particularly Fujian province, they encountered rebels holding out against Manchu rule, repeatedly resisting attempts to be conquered and colonized. The Ming rebels were led by Zheng Chengkong, also known as Guo Xingya, who took control of the coastal areas of southern China. To push back the Manchus, Guo Xingya's troops advanced north to capture the city of Nanjing. Though they managed to partially encircle the city, they failed to pry it from the Manchus and eventually were forced to retreat. That failure to capture Nanjing marked the start of Guo Xingya's defeat, and soon Manchu troops were advancing into Fujian province, and in 1661, Guo Xingya fled mainland China for Taiwan. To quash further resistance to Manchu rule, the Shu Ji Emperor of Qing issued an edict that all people living along the coast of Fujian, Guangdong, Zhejiang, Jiangnan, and Shandong provinces be evacuated inland. This was to create a strip of no man's land that would prevent villagers from aiding the rebels holding out in Taiwan. During this great upheaval, commoners living along the coast of Fujian province were uprooted from their homes and forced to move inland. But they were moving into places that were already inhabited and not at all welcoming to receiving refugees. Caught in that situation and not at all enjoying the idea of living under Manchu rule, many of these Hokkien refugees took to the sea. Many left their Hokkien homeland in the dead of night, secretly and often in not seaworthy fishing boats. Praying to their sea goddess Macho for safe passage, they braved the choppy waters of the South China Sea, bringing with them everything in their possession. They were men, women, children, and even livestock. They were the undocumented 17th century boat people. These Hokkien refugees were distributed throughout Southeast Asia, arriving in Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Borneo, Malaya, Java, Sumatra, Siam, and even Burma. Being numerous in numbers, they were able to retain the use of their language among themselves, and they populated coastal towns where Hokkien merchants once traded. And with the presence of women in their midst, they were able to father new generations who continued to speak the Zhangzhou and Quanzhou variants of Hokkien. But because they were illiterate, and I will do a separate video to explain the Hokkien language, they were unable to write their history. Yet, they left their mark throughout Southeast Asia. And in Taiwan, which is closest to Fujian province, they overwhelmed the indigenous population, making their language the language of Taiwan. Refugees from Changzhou, possibly fleeing China in a flotilla, arrived en masse on the coast between the southern part of the Isthmus of Kra to the northern part of the Malay Peninsula. They populated coastal towns which erstwhile were visited by the Hokkien merchants. There they began a new life away from China and with no means of return. Towns such as Nakhon Si Thammarat, Songkhla, Kuala Kedah, and Kuala Muda possibly received an influx of such refugees. Separately, the refugees from Quanzhou arrived on the southern coast of the Malay Peninsula, populating coastal towns and villages from Perak to Johor and Singapore. These two groups, speaking two distinct variants of Hokkien, formed the seed population of the future Penang Hokkien and Singapore Hokkien. Isolated from China, the refugees created a new hybrid culture, adopting local attire and using local ingredients to create new dishes. For example, in the absence of wheat flour, they improvised with rice flour, producing their own version of laksa. The refugees and their descendants created a new folk religion with elements of Taoism and animism. They subscribe to the existence of guardian spirits that have to be appeased. This is manifested in the worship of Datuk Kong, and in every settlement there would also be a temple dedicated to the local guardian or Tua Pek Kong. Between 1661 and 1683, China shut down all maritime trade. Only in 1684, with increased economic pressure, did the Kangxi Emperor finally lift the ban on private trading, enabling a new generation of Hokkien seafaring merchants to visit Southeast Asia. When the merchants returned, they reconnected with offsprings of those Hokkien refugees. Cut off from contact with China for decades, those who had survived evolved to speak a creolized version of Hokkien, which is the beginning of the language we now know as Penang Hokkien. But even then, Penang was not yet established. The merchants realized that the localized Hokkien people were different from them and learned that the Malays called these people the Baba Nyonyas. Here it's worth pointing out that I differentiate the Baba Nyonyas of Penang from the Peranakans of Malacca. The Baba Nyonyas of Penang speak Penang Hokkien, which has Zhangzhou Hokkien as the base with a sprinkling of Malay loanwords. In contrast, the Peranakans of Malacca speak Baba Malay with a sprinkling of Hokkien words. While the Peranakans trace their ancestry to a mixed parentage of mostly Hokkien fathers with local women, the Baba Nyonyas of Penang trace theirs to parents who were both migrants from Changzhou. And while both the Baba Nyonyas and returned merchants were both Hokkiens, and specifically of Changzhou, there is a major difference between the two groups. The Baba Nyonyas were illiterate. They spoke a vernacular Hokkien that did not have a writing system. In the 19th century, after Penang became a British settlement, The Baba Nyonyas learned to read and write, but not in Penang Hokkien. They learned English that enabled them to take on white-collar employment in the British administration. Their own language, Penang Hokkien, does not have its own writing system until as recently as 2013. On the other hand, the merchants who reconnected with the Baba Nyonyas in the 17th and 18th centuries spoke not only vernacular Hokkien, they were also able to read and write in what they considered written Hokkien, but is actually classical Chinese pronounced in the Hokkien literary reading. Literacy enabled the merchants to compile their genealogy, keep log of their commerce, communicate with the Mandarins, and above all, write history, though it is history from their own perspective and specifically one that documented their own clans. The merchants would form clan associations to look after the welfare of fellow clansmen, to facilitate clansmen migration, and to worship their ancestors, patron saints, and deities. The merchants did note the presence of the Baba Nyonyas who predated their arrival, but as far as they were concerned, history began with they themselves. Moreover, having not kept records of their history, the Baba Nyonyas were unable to explain it to anybody. As a result, the Baba Nyonyas were given no credit for having established the infrastructure that facilitated the merchants' return. Without the Baba Nyonyas, the merchants would once again be marrying native women and fathering offsprings that spoke Baba Malay. The presence of the Baba Nyonyas enabled the merchants to marry into local society while retaining the use of their Changzhou variant of Hokkien. The history of the Baba Nyonyas was left unwritten, unknown, forgotten, and even replaced with a distorted understanding of who they were. With the founding of Penang in 1786, the door opened for more migrants to arrive, especially after China was defeated in the Opium War of 1842 and was forced to open another Fujian seaport to trade. By then, the seaport of Changzhou, being located on a river, was silting up and had gone into decline. So, a new seaport was established. Its name is Amoy, also known today as Xiamen, and it became the new departure point for Chinese migrants to Malaya. Migrants from southern China arrived in Penang in increasing numbers, especially in the 1870s, overwhelming and outnumbering the existing population of Baba Nyonyas and merchants who collectively became known as the Lao Cat or old-timers. The new arrivals, called the Singcat, included not only the Changzhou Hokkiens but also the Quanzhou Hokkiens, the Xiamen Hokkiens, the Cantonese, Teochews, Hakkas, Taishanese, Hokkien, and Hainanese. Each brought with him a different variant of Hokkien or an entirely different Chinese language. Yet over time, they all subscribed to speaking Penang Hokkien, which has entrenched itself as the lingua franca. Significant numbers of Malays and Indians also spoke Penang Hokkien. From the time it was brought over by Changzhou refugees to present time, the language has been used by different groups of people who enrich it with loan words from Malay, English, and since the 20th century from Mandarin as well. Other Chinese languages such as Cantonese and Teochew also left their mark on the language. It has become an all-embracing, all-inclusive language that belongs not only to the Changzhou Hokkiens, but to all who consider themselves Penangites. And this, my friend, is the history of Penang Hokkien, our language, our heritage. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to give it a like so that YouTube will show it to more people and more will understand and appreciate the history of Penang Hokkien. Also, subscribe to this channel to learn more about Penang Hokkien and click the notification bell to be informed every time I upload a new video. Until we meet again in my next video, thanks for watching.